this event. Please feel free to turn them on and off as you would like. The option is listed on the bottom of the Zoom window with the button, I think it says live captioning. Please also note that tonight's event is being recorded. I will first read land and labor acknowledgement specific to Illinois State University, but since this is a virtual event and open to the public, I really want to encourage us all to explore these for the specific areas that you might be joining us from tonight. All right, so we would like to express gratitude for the opportunity to gather on the traditional lands of the Illini, Peoria, and the Mi'kmaq, and later due to colonial encroachment and displacement to the Fox, Potawatomi, Sauk, Shawnee, Winnebago, Iowa, Muscotan, Piankashaw, Wee, and Kickapoo nations. We also wish to express honor to those Indigenous peoples who may have been excluded in this acknowledgement due to erasure and historical inaccuracy. The land that Illinois State University was built on is the traditional birthright of many Native nations. Centuries of displacement and dispossession and displacement persist, and we wish to acknowledge and pay respect to the land back movement for sovereignty being led by many Indigenous peoples today. And for our labor acknowledgement, we must acknowledge that this country would not exist if it was not for the free and enslaved labor of Black people due to violence and white supremacy. We wish to pay respect to the Black Lives Matter movement in recognition of the ongoing violence against Black people in the United States today. And we must work to honor the legacy of the African diaspora and Black life knowledge and skills. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention to these acknowledgements. One of the most important aspects of these acknowledgements is simply to just recognize that they're only that, an acknowledgement. They're only a very small step towards meaningful change, and we must work to and commit to educating ourselves, learning and unlearning harmful power dynamics that systems of power and therefore we perpetuate often unknowingly. There are many incredible movements being led today, as I mentioned, and we must listen to those leading them to work alongside and in solidarity. As members of a public settler colonial institution, we acknowledge our responsibility not only to understand these histories, but to also actively confront the ways in which colonial and white supremacist policies and thinking continue in our lives. So also before I introduce the program, I want to note that in the next coming days, I'll be emailing an event resources list to everyone who registered. This is just a short list with links and resources about the speaker tonight, as well as relating to the land and labor acknowledgement that I just read. This is no means a comprehensive guide, but rather just a jumping off point for some further engagement. And if you have any questions or suggestions for future event resource lists, please feel free to email me. So I would like to welcome everyone tonight to Future Ancestral Technologies, How Will We Dream of Our Collective Future with Cannupa Hanska Luger. This is the fourth event in the 2021-22 speaker series, Experiencing Images, How the Visual Shapes Our World. This lecture series features distinguished speakers from a variety of backgrounds to explore individual and collective engagement with images. Through decoding this visual landscape, we become more conscious of how we use images to construct identity and meaning. My name is Holly Filsinger. I'm a graduate student in the Visual Culture program here at ISU and the curator for the series. I want to thank the Won-Soo Kim School of Art for hosting, the Office of Research and Graduate Studies for the opportunity to create the speaker series, and our co-sponsors for the series, whose names you see here on the screen. Without them, none of this would be possible, so a big thank you to all of them. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome Cannupa Hanska Luger to ISU tonight. Cannupa Hanska Luger is a multidisciplinary artist and an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes of Fourth Berthold, Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, Lakota, and European descent. These, through monumental installations and social collaboration, Luger activates speculative fiction and communicates stories about 21st century indigeneity, combining critical cultural analysis with dedication and respect for the diverse materials, environments, and community he engages. He lectures and produces large-scale projects around the globe, and his works are in many public collections. Luger is a recipient of the 2021 United States Artist Fellowship Award for Craft and was named a 2021 Grist Fixer. He's a 2020 Creative Capital Fellow and a 2020 Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow, and a recipient of the Museum of Arts and Design's 2018 inaugural Burke Prize, among many others. So again, I would like to thank you all for joining tonight, and I'm going to turn it on over to Cannupa.
Dosha, Maragua, Dishkagnahudo Nituehudo Sham, Cannupa Hanska Luger, Nueta, Hidatsa, Rikara, Lakota, European. Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Who are you and why have you come? Are the rhetorical questions that I've placed in our customary language, Hidatsa. And I am excited to be here with you all. I'm going to try to do some stuff that might be a little bit different as far as how we're going to present today. I'm really excited about the opportunities that our the restrictions of our capacity to be in proximity to one another allots us the privilege of being in one another's kind of private homes and spaces. You all are joining me here in my studio from my perspective in Glorieta, New Mexico. Glorieta is right outside of the town of Santa Fe, which is, this is all customary land of the Tewa and Towa people. There was a pueblo just across the interstate from where I live right now called Pecos, Pecos Pueblo. Now it's a small town, but this area of Glorieta has been a thoroughfare. It's the southernmost crossing through the continental United States to pass over the Rockies. So I live on a mountain pass. We got about 8 inches of snow last night, so it's a little bit chilly in my studio. And I acknowledge that it's still, there's an interstate that runs through this region. So, you know, what came before us, animals, plants, wind, all of these sorts of things, you know, an acknowledgement of the land truly as the land has kind of permeated through this space for time immemorial. And I have the privilege of living right at the crux of this kind of past. So waters flow in every direction from where I am. And I'm excited to be with you all. I have a background in ceramics. Actually, that's what brought me to New Mexico. I'm from North Dakota. I'm from the Fort Berthold Reservation. That's where I'm an enrolled member. I was born on the Standing Rock Reservation, both of which are on the Missouri River. So I'm like river people from way back. And now I live at like 8,000 feet up in the mountains. So it's kind of wild, kind of strange. I still have connections to back home, return home every summer. There are certain kind of cultural responsibilities that my family takes care of, as well as on my dad's side of my family, we're all cowboys. So I grew up an Indian cowboy, you know, which is kind of a contradiction just to begin with in the minds of most people. But growing up, all the cowboys I knew were Indians, and I was like, these movies got it wrong. And I think it's kind of interesting to think about that relationship of expectation, especially in the face of kind of the speaker series, visuals, imagery, film, cameras, all of these things have this inherent kind of bias in them that I think it's kind of fascinating to explore, especially in the present of our time where we share everything. We all live in public in a lot of ways, and our kind of primary source of relationship at this point is through like these digital lenses. I've grown accustomed to them, and I've adapted my practice to them. And so I have a lot of work that explores the intersections of film and documentation and digital media in relationship to a background in ceramics, which is just like, you know, one of the oldest practices in the human experience. And I'm really kind of fascinated and came into film and film work through documenting physical objects. So my career started after my undergrad. I had the privilege and access to become a part of a gallery here in Santa Fe that I later, within a few years, dropped out of. But it did put me in a position of creating objects, you know, and put me into the economy of art as object, which I think is kind of strange. From my perspective, art is it's a verb, you know, it's an action, an activity, and a process. And I found myself kind of like tethered more so to the world of craft in America than fine art, although I have representation in fine art spaces. The idea of craft for me is kind of a little bit more focused on process, which I think aligns a little bit closer to my idea of what art truly is. Process of creating it and all of the exploration and ideas that are generated out of that. And I'm bringing all of this up because I don't know, I have many facets of my practice, and I don't know where one ends and the next begins, other than kind of telling the general arc of the story. And here, I think we're going to really focus on future ancestral technologies, which is it's a series of work that's kind of had many different iterations of it, but it's I wanted to play around with this concept, and I'll give you the reasons why. Initially, my practice was, I was a writer for years and years, poet. I write. I'm 43 years old. I just turned 43 this month. And when I was in high school, there was a thing in the world called slam poetry, and I was about it. I loved slam poetry, and there was a performative aspect of it that I really enjoyed because it was a little bit closer to an indigenous perspective, especially a culture that, where I'm from, we have oral traditions. So all of our stories are told from one generation to the next. So I never wanted to work on a book of poetry that could be shared and written. I enjoyed the performance of it. To memorize something and to share it felt a little bit more honest. And there was a lot more flexibility. I could speak the exact same poem on two different nights. I mean, hell, in the same evening with a different kind of emotional context, and it would take on a whole new story. And I think that's the power of oral cultures and oral traditions, is that there is an emphasis on the orator to present the work, and it is, whether they like it or not, subject to our present. It's subject to our experiences. The orator's kind of ability to communicate some of these ideas is intrinsically like aligned with all of the narrative aspect of the story that's been passed down. And so I say all of this because when I like I said, I used to do slam poetry and was a part of that whole scene, and then got exhausted by it. I got exhausted by all of the things that I liked about it. Actually, eventually became the thing that I struggled with, where it was like, I don't even know if you're concerned with what I'm saying, rather than how cleverly I've aligned my cadence to your ear, so I found, I had a lot of peers who were in that scene, and they all started kind of leaning towards hip hop. They pulled their all of the time in poetry slams, and we all pitched in and got MPCs and 808 beat machines. And these are like early recording technology, or at least mechanisms for producing sound, sampling, all the stuff. Quickly, I am I should be trying to MC in any sort of way. So I started painting, and I started painting live on stage because I have social anxiety. I'm a lot more comfortable in front of everybody than I am in a crowd. And so that would keep me from going to shows. So this was like a way for me to actually go to music events and have a social experience without like suffering from the anxiety of being in a crowd. And that all kind of like, I brought that to New Mexico when I moved here to go to school at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And while I was here, I found that I wasn't actually even really a painter, which is what I came in thinking that I was going to be, and realized that I just knew how to draw with color. Like it was a lot more graphic. And so I was taught by really great instructors here on how to paint, but I wanted to retain my aesthetic. So I was like, well, let me look at something else. Let me start from zero. And and I got into clay. I had a wonderful instructor here who shared, well, I took her class, but she had the capacity to realize that I was going to produce more than her curriculum kind of had. And so she just gave me a table in the back of the classroom and said, knock yourself out, like, go crazy, make everything you want, make, fail fast, fail, build with clay. And it truly was. And it taught me not more than just how to kind of push and shape and model clay, but also it taught me patience and relieved my expectations. I'm a child of the 80s, and I grew up on sugar and MTV and needed everything instantly. And so clay kind of toned that down and was like, it's not about that. It's about the process. Like, if you don't enjoy the trip, you're not going to like where you're going to end up, And so clay had been this kind of like instructor that really kind of changed and shaped my life. And making three-dimensional objects in the 21st century, I quickly realized that 90% of my work seen is going to be seen two-dimensionally. And so I focused on making connections with photographers to document my work and to share my work. I was allotted privileges because I had good documentation of my work, where like maybe the work wasn't better than everybody else in the exhibition, but my photograph was. And so that got me on the cover of the poster for the thing, or in print, all of these sorts of things. And so I started to realize that there is a lens and a gaze that I'm going to be forced to be subject to. So how do I become how do I control what images are being presented? And in that, it also made me recognize the inherent violence that's embedded in photography. Shooting is normalized, capturing is normalized. And that language is stuff that I'm always constantly kind of trying to shift and change in my own practice. And the future ancestral technology work really developed out of this object making experience that I was having, where I was building sculptural forms, but I was first kind of, my intro art was indigenous art kind of market, which is adjacent to the larger kind of fine art experience. And I always thought it was interesting that there wasn't room to step into that space, because there was already a space allotted for me, and should be happy with that, And I did appreciate it, but I think at the same time, the American art canon, with the voice of many people from across this continent, we're starting to agree that the American art canon has holes in it. There are huge gaps where I would say European American men were reaping the benefit of repurposing and recontextualizing Black and Indigenous ideas, and then embedding that into the museum space. And without any sort of acknowledgement of the contribution, the canon has holes. It's inconsistent. And I think that the industry itself is beginning to recognize that without bolstering the representation in these spaces, then it's thin. Then what's presented as a national identity is thin. And so my work began to kind of like look at that blatantly, and I was making ceramic. They were not culturally specific in any way, and rather what I was doing was taking like this idea of Indian art and regurgitating that, appropriating the idea of indigenous art or Indian art, and drawing that from the market's demand, and chewing it up and spitting it back out and putting it on a pedestal and saying, this is what you're looking for. This is what you want. And it has no power, no cultural significance, no emphasis. It is void of that. And here you go. And I think that idea began to kind of like creep in. One, I couldn't do that forever because it felt as hollow as it was what I was making, felt hollow on myself as well. And so I began to think about like, I have the privilege of being a part of this landscape. I'm an extension of this land. And that's a rare privilege that Native people have in a country of displaced people. We can go to geological sites, very old geological sites, point to them with our children and tell a story that's ancient and relates them to the land itself. So you become an extension of it. And that's a privilege that I acknowledge. And with that privilege, also of telling that story and connecting one generation to the next, so that the knowledge of that relationship is never lost. And so that's what kind of birthed into this idea of future ancestral technology. I started to consider the positionality of Indigenous art, the market's demand, which was almost primarily historical in nature, or quote, that traditional, it was imposed traditional way. But from my upbringing to present, the most traditional or customary practice of my people has been adaptation. We've always adapted to the variations that we've experienced, and that adaptability to be like an intersectional space with human beings across the globe. Like, if we don't adapt, we die. And I think about even the things that were considered traditional, like for Native people, beadwork, is within the now. This is my mother's beadwork, and this has been like my birthday and Christmas gifts for the past couple of years, because she's like, "You're the hardest person to buy something for," and I'm like, "Beat me a brim on a hat." Have me still? Am I back on? Hello? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I live rurally, so there are windows, and like I said, there's a snowstorm, and I have like satellite internet, and granted, it's thing. So I just got it like maybe 2 weeks ago, and I'm like, it works great until there's like a snowstorm, and then you're like, well, that's kind of blocking it. But this is good. This is better than what we had before. The future ancestral technology work was really looking at creating, and there's like anything that you're seeing in the slideshow here is kind of little bits and pieces of some of these ideas. For me was, I am a science fiction fan. I know the power of presenting ideas to our community, to our people, to our culture. I know the power of science fiction to kind of like create a path for us to move towards. And my concern was, I never see us or our people or our contributions in the future. And so I focused a lot of my efforts into presenting a relationship that helps literally my people see us in a future context. And with that, what I'm really intrigued with is some of these ideas that presently are being once again appropriated and repurposed and sold as like green economies, really being derivative from indigenous knowledge that has been previously looked down upon as primitive. But suddenly it's like, oh, actually what they were doing was profound in relationship to the environment. And so now let's repackage that and sell it back, to everybody. And I thought it would be really important that the acknowledgement of where that knowledge is gained from, the impact on our indigenous communities is profound. To see our contribution to the present literally will save lives. It's hard to be so invisible in popular culture that we suffer from really high rates of suicide and drug abuse and addiction. And more often, people represent that as the poverty of our places. But when everybody's the same amount of poor, you don't acknowledge how poor you are. And I think the real contribution of the trauma from that is as we began to share. Like, I remember cable TV coming onto the res and watching, let's say, I'm trying to find a TV show that generations would all see simultaneously. But I remember seeing, like, when I was a kid, I remember seeing Full House. That was the show. You had a whole bunch of white guys living in a house, with kids. And that was like the norm, that was like the median. This was a middle class kind of family, and they're living together. And I'm like, holy shit, if that's middle class, then I am poor. I am really poor. And I think the impact of seeing kind of like popular culture being presented through visual images, and then access to those visual images from all of these different cultures kind of across the globe, shifts the expectation of where you're at kind of nationally or in popular culture. And whenever I saw myself on TV, it was in a historical context. It was Dances with Wolves. It was, all of these kind of like iterations of indigenous kind of contribution, but in a historical context. So the psychological effect of that is whatever we are now, which is absolutely not what we were in those images, has no purpose, no point. And when you have no purpose and no point, you don't see the contribution of your culture to the present, then you struggle with drive. What do I do? How can I do? Will it make any difference? Is anybody looking? And so the future ancestral technology kind of concept was like, well, let me, with the privilege that I have as an artist and to exist in a public space, let me present on our cultures and imagine us in a future space, so that even if we are struggling with representation and visibility presently, what you're seeing is us surviving this, and really celebrating the survival aspects of indigenous culture in the wake of, what the Judeo-Christian kind of tomes would say is an apocalypse. Like, what you see here is Mad Max Cannupa. Like, I have literally scrounged everything I could in a completely different world and slapped it on me to exist in this place, to survive this place, because I am a post-apocalyptic human being, and I'm like 2-3 generations into that apocalypse, and we survive it. And I think that there's something powerful in that position. And it also, I do not fear the threat of this fall, because I'm, like I said, 3 generations into an absolute total apocalypse, cultural and lifeways, economies, like all of the things that our communities and cultures kind of developed had been flipped upside down. And we still maintained, we still hid. When it was illegal, we hid our ceremonies, and we maintained them. And I had the privilege, being born in 1979, to actually practice our spirituality because it was illegal until 1978 in the United States. So I grew up with access to our spiritual world without the threat of violence. And I wanted to celebrate that for future generations. So the future ancestral technology, it's an access point to engage with other people in other communities. But for me personally, it exists in a space to reach my immediate communities, my indigenous youth, kind of, across the continent, to celebrate our existence in a way that's slightly different. And benefit of using speculative fiction and imagining this space is that I can also hybridize cultural contexts, like prior to contact and then prior to reservation period, where we were all allotted small plots of land in our homes. Our cultures would blend and shift and change and divide. We had the capacity to build new cultures, new communities, new groups. And since reservation period and us being kind of like tallied on roles, we don't have as much flexibility to develop that sort of kinship and relationship. But in an imagined space, I can bypass all of that and say, oh yeah, no, we got past that. And we shared culture. We shared all of these experiences, and new things kind of developed out of that and hybridized. And I think with that is, how that exists. I have like very simple kind of ideas. One is concepts of time. Time is a really strange thing, and for Indigenous people, time goes in both directions. We're not a point with a ray going in one direction, but rather it splits in multiple directions. So even the title of the work is called Future Ancestral Technology, and it's an acknowledgement that our positionality in a temporal space is that the only reason I'm here is because of the efforts and the sacrifices and the knowledge gleaned and shared from my ancestors. They've passed that to me. And my responsibility here is to acknowledge the fact that I'm only borrowing this place from future generations who do not exist yet. And so our protocols are developed through that concept of time. That time doesn't exist with your life, but rather like 3 generations in every direction. Your children, your children's children, and then children you will never meet, is who I must be accountable to in my practice, in my life, in every sort of way. So strong kind of aspect of a lot of Indigenous cultures kind of globally is an acknowledgement and a recognition that it's not so hyper individualized, which I think is a part of the American myth, perhaps, that we're kind of like forced to participate in. And so I'm like, well, I can let go of all of that stuff in an imagined world. Like I can falter and make mistakes in my present. But if I'm creating a future context, let me draw from my ancestral knowledge, pass that through me, and imagine where the children I will never meet will be existing. And so there are a couple of like simple ethos that I try to play with. I tried to write this whole story down one time, and that didn't really pan out. And I found out the best way to kind of describe it was to actually build something that's a little bit closer to like a Dungeons and Dragons manual. I'm like, this is the world. These are the contexts. These are the things that every individual in this future space has to figure out how to thrive in. So rather than telling the story of this is how it's going to be, let me provide for you the world in which you have to survive. And that's been like the closest way I've come to like documenting this narrative. And some of the things in it is one, I was looking at where we are presently and kind of like the advancement in our mechanized technology at present. We've really leaned into communication, and with that communication power, there are some extremely wealthy people, and those people are pushing and pulling on the like economies of the globe. And their benefit from that is they've began like a new space race and this like endeavor to be a multi-planet culture, And I'm like, I support it. You should totally go. Like I think this is why I have Starlink. I'm like, let me give you what you need so that you can build a ship and leave this place. I imagine around with future, like the call wet drinks in this problem, let me empower imaginations and organisms. Um, so I'm like, yeah, go. But there's nothing for all of us on that ship, and for me, I'm like, I'm right now. And so I'm imagining what it would look like without that influence on a global scale. And so that's one kind of like aspect. The colonizer is gone. How do we build a culture without that influence? The second thing is they will have extracted everything that they need from this place with total disregard because they're not coming back. So we will be facing a dramatically different environment. How do we adapt to that change, and how do we, rather than perpetuate this post-apocalyptic idea, how do we actually build kinships and relationships with more than human species to fix the trauma of that and actually celebrate it, not as something that has happened to us, but something that we can change together, And then the next thing that I play around with is there's going to be a lot of trash from our present. We produce a lot of waste. And so all of the regalia that I build is built entirely out of repurposed material. So that's the other ethos that I'm kind of like generating. How do you reuse something until it's absolutely disintegrated, rather than like throw it away and bury it and forget about it, So these are like some of the concepts that I'm playing around with in this space. And then also just looking at really basic things like some of our customary practices. One of the first large scale pieces that I did with this was this teepee. I come from people who lived in teepees and were nomadic people. And I'm like, I love the nomadic like concept. And the reality is like today I can, pull up my whatever Spotify, and there will be a van life playlist. You know what I'm saying? Like this idea of living in a van has become so like embedded in a certain generation that there is. I'm like, oh, you're being nomadic again. Like that's nomadic existence. It's totally possible. So what does that look like? And I was looking at our teepee, and our teepee design was built for mobility, but presently teepees, the skins are made out of really heavy canvas. The poles are made out of wood, really close to their original. The original skins were really made out of skins, buffalo hides and stuff like that. And they got moved to canvas when buffalo were eradicated to get rid of my people. But we decided to go to canvas, and then it just kind of stuck there. And I was like, I need a pickup truck with a lumber rack to haul my teepee to get from one place to another. And that doesn't feel very nomadic anymore. So I designed some poles that could collapse and fit into a Nissan Sentra or a Honda Civic from like 1997, because I was figured like, that's probably the most driven and operated vehicle for my community. Like, why can't we haul a teepee with that? And so the poles collapse. And I had the skins remade a couple of times. I built one myself, and then I hired another person to make me one using like present kind of ripstop tent material, So now my teepee can fit in a Honda Civic and weighs probably like 65 pounds, which is pretty nuts considering it's a 13-foot teepee with like more poles than it really needs. But the poles there's 13 poles in it. And the teepee itself is more than just a shelter. It's also it's a cosmological lens. So the design of it represents everything that's in sky is also here on Earth, So there's cosmology and meaning embedded in the design and the form. And that's something that I'm really interested in kind of sharing and moving forward by creating a speculative fiction for Indigenous people. And then the next thing that I wanted to kind of like dive in a little bit, and then I'm going to open it up for dialogue and conversation and making statements and asking questions and all sort of stuff, which is the other big thing that I saw as a painful addition to science fiction is homogeny. This idea of that harmony has to come at the cost of homogeny, and I just do not believe that at all. And I think that that's perpetuated in a lot of science fiction narratives. And I'm really intrigued with like the culture that I'm developing in this future ancestral technology. I am excited for the day that I get to work with another artist or futurist from another cultural context and allow our two cultures to coexist simultaneously in the world. Because I honestly and truly believe like the complexity and the diversity of cultural knowledge is based on its relationship to land. And the land is too large to understand as a whole. And rather, there is really specific, beautiful things that develop out of commitment to regional areas. And I'm like, let's celebrate that. And let's actually move towards that. If you don't want to be a part of the homogenous narrative, you are not enemy of the homogeny. You know, you are just an alternative expression of what it means to exist and survive on the plane. And how could cultural exchange actually, and how has cultural exchange benefited by having the knowledge of different places and different locations, instead of extracting that knowledge from one another, appropriating and repurposing it? How do we acknowledge that relationship and actually build a firmer understanding by celebrating the complexity and the diversity of cultures on the globe, and then maybe take that into space? Once you've figured out how to do it here, then build your ship and go exploring. You know, that's my insight into all of that. And so at this point, I would love for us to stop the sliding show of images and then open up the possibility of popping on your camera and chopping it up with me in my studio. While I've been doing my whole spiel, I've been rolling a cigarette kind of over and over, which I am going to smoke because you're in my house right now. And it's okay for me to do that. So yeah, any kind of ideas or statements or anything? I know I saw some things coming into the chat, but I was too busy talking to read. I am not that kind of multitasker. Thank you. And you're welcome. And if we come to a lull or anything like that, Holly, I also, open up the possibility of some of the ideas that you're playing with imagery and all of that. I would, I think we had the beginnings of a cool conversation before we opened all of this up. So if it gets clunky or laggy, we can jump in there too. But yeah, I encourage people to dive in if you have something to say. We'll figure out how order happens in the process.
Hi, I'm a big fan of your work. I'm in art education, and I'm really excited about showing work like this and kind of other artists under the kind of indigenous futurism, very general grouping, to all the students who are going to be teachers. And I generally kind of talk about it in concert with and in dialogue with Afrofuturism. And you mentioned kind of like different forms of, looking at the, current and post-apocalypse in, kind of other cultural positions. And I wondered if you kind of see any, connections or like, artists that inspire you or like artists you want to talk to or kind of feel like you're talking to or are talking to kind of in the Afrofuturist realm.
Yeah, I mean, I hands down, I'm an Octavia Butler fan. Like, I love the description of the it's like a dive into a future space that's not over focused on the mechanism of technology to get us to that place, but the survivance of culture and storytelling, and the importance of that embedded in that kind of speculative presence. That seems the most applicable to affect change in forward movement, because it's not, you're not waiting for Star Trek's like material fucking thing, whatever that thing was that they made that like all of a sudden nobody needed anything anymore and we're good. You don't have to wait for that. It's really about your kind of immediate and present. And then I think there's like so many Afrofuturists that I'm intrigued to kind of like begin those dialogues with, but also an acknowledgement of Afro-Indigenous relationships and the kinships of Afro-Indigenous communities here in America because our cultures were similar enough that the absorption, adaptation, and change of cultures was like immediately applicable upon escaping enslavement and or also just like farming in general and relationships of displacement in not just the region that they're located, but also in all of these other aspects. So that's, to begin with, I wanted to start with that, but there are a lot of folks, and I'm really intrigued with how those stories would develop in relationships. So like I had said, like one of my kind of big goals is to like imagine, like I would love an opportunity to create some sort of exhibition work or like a physical camp, like what if a bunch of futurists from a bunch of different cultures decided to build a camp for like a month and bring their kind of story and narrative into it and actually live that imagined future space. That would be intriguing to me. And then see what comes out the other side of it because of the cultural exchange, that'd be fascinating.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Byron, do you want to unmute and ask your question that you put in the chat?
Oh,
Yeah,
why do you have to know me, Holly, and call me out like that? So no, thank you for this talk and thank you for sharing the work. It was wonderful to see this. And I had said to tell you I'm enamored with it. But, I went to New York a couple months ago to see the exhibit called Before Yesterday We Could Fly. And I think the way you talked about this tonight really put it in some context for me because I'm continuing to think about this right now. When I was young, Virginia Hamilton put a book out and the People Could Fly, right? And it's about flying Africans because of the slave trade, right? And this fantasy of being able to fly out of that mess, right? And so, but what I just started thinking about was this notion of the transatlantic slave trade, right? The water, right? And so being this displaced people from Africa, but something about that water and that space, right? And the Afrofuturism that I think that takes place in that space, but also this notion of eminent domain, right? With Seneca Village, it became Central Park, right? That people are just now really starting to understand what that is because so much of what happened in this country is just now starting to be, talked about. Well, yeah. I guess we can still talk about it. I don't know, that might get shut down also, but, so I think it's fascinating. The one thing I'd love to hear you talk about is I know we say Afrofuturism quite a bit. And my concern is, Afrofuturism is very limited in its scope because what it doesn't take into account is Black women's work also, right? So we're starting to now think about these terms of Afrofuturism, right? And it's a way for us to talk about the way Black women have created this space, right? And the way that space is taken away from them. So, I don't know if it was more of a question or more of a comment, but, I love the fact that you talked about doing this collaboration, right? At some point. So I just wonder, maybe talk about what that might look like in your mind. How do you see that looking?
Yeah, I'm like so afraid of presenting any sort of expectation on what that would look like because in my life I found that like every time I expect something I'm disappointed, but if I don't, I'm like, man, what came out of that was actually better than even what I would have expected, and it's hard to like bridge those two things. But you're bringing up stuff that like is also fascinating to me. I was just on a panel earlier today talking about patriarchy in relationship to let's say museum spaces. That was kind of like the focus and presence. But I was also thinking about and something that you just also kind of like move towards, Byron, which is labor. I think we have a hard time talking about gender equity, race equity, all of these different sort of things because we're not describing the heart of the issue, and the heart of the issue is the amount of labor that goes into these different spaces. So how do we develop like labor equity and what it means? I mean, I have definitely sat in a place of privilege as a man, you know, in the cultural expectation of what I do and bring to the table. I mean, even tonight, I didn't have a PowerPoint really to present, and so I put the labor on Holly to like pull up my website and just allow the opening screen to scroll through all of the work that I'm doing. And I acknowledge that that is a part of privilege and labor disparity that I'm perpetuating, you know, in that narrative. So apologies, Holly, and also grateful that you did that for me, because I showed up with inequity already, you know, in this space. So, but I think that there's interesting conversations that can unfold around that. And as you were mentioning, Afra, you know, futurism and this idea of the labor of women, and even in our discussion earlier with this patriarchy group, I'm tying you back to a whole nother set of boxes and faces that I was talking to earlier today, but I don't know where one ends and the next begins at this point. But you know, one thing that we were talking about was even like the term patriarchy is like every culture has different roles in relationship to that, patriarchal and matriarchal roles. And I was describing our prior to contact, our cultural relationship between matriarchal and patriarchal spaces. The tribe, my community, Mandan communities, Hidatsa communities, they are a clan system. So my clan is Awakhe, Dripping Earth Clan. And our clan's responsibility for the community was we were the builders. We built our earth lodges. We lived in earth lodges along the river. And when the earth lodge begins to fail, water runs through and it begins to drip. And that what you see, that structure, it's like a drippy sandcastle, is Awakhe. And that's when you would call our people, our clan, to fix, repair, or destroy and rebuild, you know, a thing. It was about maintenance. And within the community, all of the heads of each clan was a matriarch. It was the eldest female in the group. And that clan group would come together and decide what was good and what was not good for the internal community. Like that was their responsibility and role. And the male role within our community was to be delegate. And so we were sent outside of the community to engage with other tribes, other people, and also in extension with that, why there has been like an emphasis on chiefs in a lot of indigenous communities. For our community specifically, we would send a man out to be a delegate, and the inherent patriarchy in, you know, the Western experiment gave us more power than we actually deserved. And so then we came back, described everything, but along the way had probably signed something without thinking it meant anything at all, you know? And then the ramifications of that is the masculine role became, like at this point, toxic within a lot of indigenous communities, as far as like tribal councils and spaces like that. And all of that's beginning to be addressed, but we're dealing with that, like these kind of like dynamics and traumas. But also, you know, I keep reducing that also to this idea of labor. Like, what's the work? What's the work that's being done in relationship to that? And is it equal, you know? And until we acknowledge that sort of equity in effort, then I think we're going to continue to have problems, you know, around even finding solutions, you know, is something that I'm spit, but I don't know. I don't have answers. I just have speculations, but yeah. And I may have kind of segued that sideways. I see Xavier with a hand up, so I'm going to acknowledge your courtesy.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. So due to like there being a lot of Eurocentrism in the Americas, do you feel like that still is like there was still a little bit of that in your work, or did you find a way to like exclude as much of that as possible?
No, I put it in. I put it all in. I think because there is, once again, as like indigenous people, we're the only way we're celebrated in popular culture is the like pre-European. And you see that once again, even going back to photography, you look at Edward Curtis's effort to record the vanishing race, you know, in his exploration of photography. He was like, he brought along a trunk of Indian stuff that he would put on native people if they didn't look Indian enough. And then he would omit also like clocks and things from people's photographs to remove that European kind of influence. And I think adaptation is really the thing. And so I can't omit it because it's a lot of everything that I've experienced all of this through, you know? So I'm like, how do we take that cultural knowledge, even the trauma, how do we transform that trauma into something generative? So that I don't pass it down genetically to my children, but rather like acknowledge that influence and try to build a sense within myself that because of all of that influence, because of that trauma, we have become very strong, you know, that the endurance of that could become somehow something that generates growth. Like, you know, and I can only describe this in metaphor. Like the best way to make a knife is with heat and pressure. If I could be the spine of the knife that has experienced that heat and that pressure, then my children and my grandchildren and children I will never meet can be the fine, fine edge of that blade. And a sharp blade is the best way to share, you know, you can divide things perfectly with a nice sharp blade. And so that's kind of like some of the little mantras that I remind myself so that I don't perpetuate the trauma that I carried on from my parents and my grandparents and my great grandparents and try to end that now. And it's a difficult ask. You know, it's a difficult ask to say, how do you create celebration for the violence and the trauma that generations experienced? And as an artist, the only way that I can is to create and imagine and believe in something beautiful that can come out of it, you know? And so I don't want to omit that from the contribution. A lot of the materials that I work with, some of my primary materials are industrialized felt. So it's wool felt that's been produced on an industrial level. It comes out of Germany. It's called Filzfelds, but there's a company here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that makes soundproofing for the shitty architecture of the 90s that is like terrible, that no longer serves the purpose of its design and is now a restaurant or something, you know? The sound of it is, the auditory aspects of these structures is terrible. So this company has been building felt kind of like sound absorbing walls and panels, but in the process of doing it, this really lovely material of wool felt that's made on an industrial level, they reduce it down to little tiny remnants. And I go and get those remnants for free. Like it is a free material because it is waste to them. And so a lot of the work that I'm building is actually looking at things that we produce presently as a global culture, and how do I adapt that to like new ideas and not allow the emphasis of Eurocentric mentality, but rather the industriousness. Like how do I transform the relics of that? And I think that's the strongest way to kind of like undermine its power. You know, is to be like, yeah, you made that, you made too much of it. There's so much of it. I can build an entire career out of what you're throwing away, you know? And so there's something kind of empowering in that position. And it also shifts the balance of power as far as like, we've generated all of this. And I'm like, you've generated enough, you've generated too much, you know, as a part of the ethos. So it's a way to kind of explore the influence, but also transition the power.
All right, thank you.
And that's one way. There are many ways to do it. Yeah.
I'll jump in here because I have 1,000 thoughts, and I'll try to keep it limited. So one of the things I really appreciate that you brought up, and I recognize when you said it, I was like, oh my God, it was because with the future ancestral technologies, when I was first learning about the work, I had this moment of realization where I was like, oh shoot, this idea that the colonizer has left in this future science future narrative, that doesn't mean that the systems of power, capitalism, colonization, imperialism, all of that has left with it, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore. And so it kind of is a really interesting, it was almost kind of like a confrontational moment for me to think about where would I be in this scenario, and just to kind of reflect on that for a moment. And I was thinking a lot about it in relationship to the perception of, as you mentioned, how this idea of indigenous peoples as primitive has been constructed, especially using time, and how the irony implicit in how primitive people somehow exist and are always regulated to the past, and versus these civilized Westerners are always on the leading edge of time, while also, again, everyone's simultaneously existing in the present moment together. And the great irony that's used, that temporal structure perpetuates even today, of course. And so I think a lot about what you said with this idea of multiple structures of time. And I think that's really powerful and interesting, because I think the way that we use time also as the oppressors is to abnegate ourselves from social responsibility of past actions as well. So in this construct, not only are the Westerners on this leading edge of time, the past is no longer relevant to them, only unless they want it to be. And so anyway, I just think that's really, really interesting. And so I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, but one of the main things I wanted to ask you was, do you see yourself in this work using time as a tool of liberation?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, the liberation exists on a personal level, right? Like I can think myself liberated and still be imprisoned. You know what I'm saying? And still navigate within structures that do everything to relinquish that. And as an artist, I can create these ideas and put them out there, but I'm not actually freeing anybody. Like, I'm not doing the true labor of generations to create the space for that freedom. All I can do is speculate, and honestly, that's all I should do. Like, as far as the position of an artist in relationship to culture, we are mirrors. We are not architects. We reflect our space and bend it and warp it as much as possible. But you do not want a committee of artists deciding what our future is going to look like. Like, and maybe it'll work in some positions, but from my experience, like, I am quick to tyranny. Like, my studio is I rule this space with an iron fist, and I do a lot of work collaborating with people, and I'm constantly checking my own positionality of like expectation and also like demand. Like, I grew up on a ranch in North Dakota. My work ethic is fucked up. Like, it's not a healthy work ethic. And I think a lot of artists also fall into that same position. They labor themselves like insanely, and to expect anybody outside of the studio to put in the amount of time and effort, even if it's on something as like dumb as like a nice painting, you know what I'm saying, or something like that, the time and the effort that's focused into that is much higher than most of society's kind of like a capacity to invest, and the return on that investment, no matter how well we get paid for the objects we create, is oftentimes, like, if you break that down to the dollar an hour level, it's heartbreaking, because of the amount of time spent thinking, contemplating, actually working, doing all of the labor of it. And I am a unique artist in the I'm seeing it more so like in the presence and the accolades and the peers of my capacity to kind of engage. Most of my other artist friends have like an atelier. They've got like a workshop and a crew that helps produce things, you know, and I'm still hammering out most of the stuff myself. And I like that, you know, I enjoy that part. But I do see the benefit of working with a team, you know, and then, but once again, like I had said, even in those structures, like I'm afraid of my own kind of like embedded expectation and demand, and it could equate to tyranny, you know. So I don't know if I should be designing the thing, but I can represent it in a way that allows an audience to begin the process of freeing their selves, or moreover present it to the system that is disabling, you know, the system that wants to keep people in places and in check. I think that's a big aspect of the work that I'm doing, is to talk to power, you know, to put myself in that position. Artists do exist on a cultural level in a unique position, which is we are simultaneously genius and insane. And so we're allotted to step into positions of power without any expectation of we can say whatever we want in those spaces. And oftentimes I see myself oftentimes being used as a tool by curators, by museum directors to talk to their board and say things that they can't say but want to, you know. They use my work as a way to leverage that narrative. And so I see that. I see that. And I don't know what the outcome of it is, but yeah, liberation for all. I've liberated a few things from grocery stores, that's for sure.
Awesome. So there's a couple quick things in the chat that I'll read. Susan Coulter, who I can send you also some of the chats if you'd like later, but Susan Coulter wrote earlier that they teach Native American Studies here on campus and was really excited to see this event, and talked about the interest in you describing 3D work that is going to be viewed and understood, you know, shared two-dimensionally though. So I can send you some of Susan's notes, because they have been sharing amazing ideas in here. And I just wanted to, so we had just a couple quick things. Susan wanted to know about the installations that you have. Are they permanent or transient? And they also noted that they love the recyclable materials.
Yeah, they are, they're not permanent installations. They move, they change. I cannibalize my own work, you know. I'll build something for an installation and then look at it again and tear pieces out, add new things. I have at present like a collection of several different regalia pieces that I use that are often embedded in the performance things. And then those regalia are exhibited in relationship to the performances, which are usually video documentations of some sort. But then those shift and adapt and change. My most recent work that I'm still kind of playing around with is whenever we have feasts and we're like big feeds where we have some sort of doing and folks are coming and we provide food for everybody within our community as like a part of the thing. For Lakota Way, like the plate that you take home afterwards, because you're expected to take some food home with you and not leave anything, you know, during the feed, is called a watecha plate. You know, the watecha, take the watecha. And I've been playing around with that idea, and I just most recently built like a vulture regalia piece. But I've been playing around with, and I'm trying to kind of like figure out how to articulate this. So this is in the works, and I'm sure it's going to be cannibalized and transformed again. But I like this idea of these animals that, once again, are also like kind of looked down upon in the hierarchy of animals as far as like the scavenger. But I love the fact that like a turkey vulture, a buzzard, you know, literally its life is built on the death of other things and the transformation of death, you know, not that they don't necessarily kill the thing. They just see the thing as dead and transform it into life for themselves. And then also by disintegrating a body, actually the benefit from that is like disease control and all of these other things. So like it proliferates in a way that's really profound. And I've been thinking about Watecha and the leftover, or what's taken away, as a model also for creating like ritualistic forms, certain dance performance that celebrates the entities that have survived off of death, survived off of loss, and transformed it to provide life for everything else around it. So that's kind of like one thing that's like totally sideways. I don't even know if that's answering any sort of question, but that's some of the ideas that I was kind of going into. What was the question? How did I end up there? I apologize.
It was a great answer.
Thank you,
Talking
Susan.
about the idea of if the installations are permanent or transient. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we
they move, they shift, they change, they adapt to the environments. That's the fun thing about an installation, is that it adapts to whatever environment that it's being exhibited in. And oftentimes the video work is actually why I got into making video work for those spaces, is to develop an augmented reality that wasn't demanding a telephone. It was like, if you entered into the space, I can transform the reality of the space by presenting the environment in which I expect these things to exist in, by filming the landscape, by filming the pieces that are being exhibited, navigating that landscape, and then present that as an extension of the installation to give context to all of the objects that exist within its install.
Awesome. So we have one more question and then we can start to wrap things up. But Shannon Eplett, one of our faculty in the theater department, asked a question. I was curious about the piece in the slideshow, the people carrying mirrors on their backs. Can you please talk more about that work?
Yeah, that was the first iteration into my look at socially engineered projects, or social engagement work. I didn't even know that was a thing, like a subset of artistic expression, social engagement. I didn't realize that, but that mirrored shield thing came out of 2016 Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock, building that pipeline across the water. So the shield was built out of, I didn't even know it was art. It was just like, I was answering a question. Because I was born in Fort Yates, which is in Standing Rock Reservation. And because I'm from there, all of the people who were interested in my work down here in New Mexico, who collected my work, when Standing Rock became something on the internet, when Standing Rock became a hashtag and not geography, everybody was like, whoa, you're the only thing that I know about Standing Rock. What's going on? And so I started pooling some resources from here in New Mexico and traveling those back to Oceti-Shikoe, the camps there that were, trying to protect the water. And in the process, that was drawn out, and it was heavy, and it was dark, and the drive of a lot of the people who were once supporting was beginning to diminish, and it diminishes and reduced to this question: I'm one person. What can I do? I'm one like it's not set in a position of like, I'm one person. What can I do? It's I'm one person. What could I do? And it's like how that question is presented. And so I was like, well, shit, I'm also one person. What could I actually do? Like, what could I do as one? What could one body do? And so that Mirror Shield project came out of, coincidentally, it was inspired by the civil unrest in the Ukraine from several years ago. And I know we're looking at that all over again presently. But when the government and the police were cracking down on people in the Ukraine, and the Ukraine were like, no, we're not going to take that anymore, and you need to listen to what the people have to say. They use the police to attack everybody. And how people in Kiev and other areas addressed that was they brought mirrors from their homes and reflected the look of a police officer in full riot gear. It's hard to see their humanity when you see a row of people dressed identically the same and operating in the same mechanism and the same movement in the same way. It's hard on the other side of that line to see their humanity. But when you reflect it, they can see themselves and they can see what you're seeing. And it had profound effects in a couple of instances, you know, where I was like, okay, I see that. Up at Standing Rock, we couldn't bring mirrors to the front line because in the Ukraine, it was happening in an urban center. So there was third-party witness to all of that. But up in Standing Rock, like on the res, out in the plains, there was no third party to like bear witness to that. And so to bring a mirror to the front line, you would end up injuring yourself. And so I didn't want to ask people to do that. So what I did instead was took a hand drill down to the largest hardware store that I could find that I knew that would be everywhere and build a mirrored shield in the parking lot. I was like, let me make it by as simple as possible. And so that if you do want to do something, you could do it. And in the process of doing it, one person with one sheet of masonite or plywood could make 6 shields. And I was like, those 6 shields could be held together and stand on the front line, separating the 125 people who are right behind that front line, who are standing in solidarity with the whole camp. That's like 10,000 people just beyond that line. And then they're all standing there, protect the water for 8 million people downstream. And so I was like, that's what one person can do. You know, one person can make that effort. And what I realized was it was the transformation of an ally into an accomplice. And I didn't expect that, but I was like, oh shit, there's something here. The amount of shields that came after I made a video on how to make it and I put it out on social media, and the amount of shields that came from that impulse kind of blew my mind. And I was like, oh, people want to do more and don't know how. And money isn't the answer. You can't throw money at the problem. But if you create a prompt for people to participate and actually embed their physical labor, once again, going back to labor and effort, now they're participating in a way that is profoundly different. And it doesn't matter what economic space you're at. I think at most it costs like maybe $60, which is a lot for some folks, but like $60 to make 6 shields that can protect 8 million people downstream. I'm like, that's simple. It's a simple solution. You know, it's a simple ask. And so those shields were some of the shields that were used and deployed there on the front lines at the Dakota Access Pipeline, but I've also seen them applied in a bunch of different ways. I made the video public, and I also made like a simple pamphlet of simple drawings, like how do you use chopsticks? I did the how do you make a mirror shield in that same simple picture fashion, so that it was kind of bridgeable to a bunch of different applications. That's the long answer.
But a great answer. Thank you. Awesome. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. We're already getting on close to 7:30. So I want to thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming and participating and asking questions and engaging in dialogue. It definitely makes our virtual Zoom meetings much more fun. And so yeah, awesome. Thank you all so much. I will be, like I said, shooting out an email to everyone in the next few days with that event resources guide. And yeah, awesome. And I will send this chat, all these wonderful messages in the chat to you, Cannupa, as well. So that way you can see everyone's messages.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. Thanks for all joining me today. Take care. Take care.